Hello, everybody here at the venue. Thanks for joining my talk. It's absolutely fantastic to be here and be a part of PyCon Czechia 2023. So about 23 years ago, when I started as a software engineer, there was a legend out there, a software engineer to whom we all looked up. Nowadays, he's best known for creating Trello and Stack Overflow. So maybe you can guess already that it's Joel Spolsky. Back then, he was best known for his blog. And his most famous blog post was, Things You Should Never Do, Part 1. Actually, I never figured out whether there's a Part 2. Does anybody of you know? So in this blog post, he named the single worst strategic mistake a software company, an organization, a team, or a developer can do. And that is to rewrite software from scratch. But actually, that is what we did for the TOX test automation tool, a tool downloaded more than 12 million times a month, both heavily used in the open source community and by multi-billion-dollar companies alike. Today, I want to tell you the story of TOX, and especially about the rewrite. You will learn about the reasons for the rewrite, the planning, the ups and downs, and how we finally released it. And most importantly, you will learn more about us, the maintainers. But first about me. My name is Jürgen Gmach. I'm a senior software engineer at Canonical, the company best known for creating Ubuntu. I work at the Launchpad team. We take care of the build infrastructure of Ubuntu, so anytime you do apt-get install, this goes through our little machines. Please reach out to me on Twitter or Mastodon. I also have a blog, but it's not as famous as Joel's. I'm one of the maintainers of TOX, and that's why I'm here. I'm a fellow of the Python Software Foundation, and I live at the outer reach of the Bavarian forest. That's all possible because of the new remote world, right? But actually, it's not new for Canonical. We are remote first and only for 19 years already. And I think we're doing pretty well with that. And actually, we are hiring, both Canonical in general, but especially also my team. So if you want to work with me, we are looking for a couple of junior Python engineers and a manager. So please reach out to me or visit my website. But now let's talk about TOX. TOX is a test automation tool. But what does that even mean? In order to explain that, we need to have a look at how testing is usually done. So let's assume you need to do this all manually. So you need to create a virtual environment, build the package, install the package, install the test dependencies like PyTest or coverage, and then you run the tests. And you need to do probably more, because you want to run linters and you also want to build documentation. And then, that is only on your PC, for one Python version, for one framework version. So you need to duplicate this process so many times. And think about setup in CI, think about your colleagues, also think about external contributors. That is pretty tedious, right? So there must be a better way. You can use TOX. Just create a configuration file, specify the Python versions you want to test against in the env list, set up the test environment. That means defining the test dependencies and the test command. And as this configuration file is checked in Git, it's available to you, to your colleagues, to external contributors, and also in CI. All you need to do is to run TOX then. I usually install TOX via pipx. Pipx is an awesome tool to install and to run Python command line tools. You should check it out. In order to understand the rewrite, we need to understand the roots of TOX. TOX was written by Holger Kriekel back in 2010. You may not be familiar with that name, but Holger not only created TOX, but also PyTest, DevPy, and PyPy. Not the package index, but the alternative Python implementation. And then some time passed, more specifically 7 years. TOX got pretty popular. Some even called it the standard in testing. And then Bernard Gabor joined the team. Not because he wanted to become an open source maintainer, but out of necessity. He wanted to have some bugs fixed and some features implemented. But soon he noticed TOX was written with very specific assumptions. It is used to create a Python environment, not a Conda environment or not a Docker environment, only on your local system. It only can be configured with a TOX ini file, not with the modern PyProject TOML file or a Python file. It is there to build source distributions and not a wheel. And it evaluates everything eagerly. So it means at the startup, you have seen the configuration file. It was very short, so it's fast, but it can grow really large. And then the startup takes a time. And he noticed that changes are very, very hard, or even impossible. So what do you do when you join a project and you're not perfectly happy about it? Obviously, you want to rewrite the project from scratch. But as you can see, it was just an attempt, so it was not finished. But Bernard learned some valuable lessons from that. And then, shortly after that, Holger left the project. And you need to know that it's something completely normal, that's something healthy in the open source community. You don't need to stick around for a project you contributed to or you created for longer than you want to. It's good for you. And when I tell people that I'm a maintainer of Tox, they ask me questions like, oh, why did you create Tox? And what is Tox meaning, the name? And I just have to tell them, I did not create it. I joined very much later. Soon afterwards, Bernard noticed a pattern in the bug reports for Tox. Actually, those bug reports were not really for Tox, but for virtualenv, which is used by Tox in order to create the virtual environments. At that time, virtualenv was not well maintained. So Bernard fixed a couple of bugs for virtualenv and eventually became a maintainer of virtualenv. So it's how it's going. And now we know already, what do you do when you join a project and you're not entirely happy about it? You rewrite it. So Bernard Gabor started rewriting virtualenv. And before I answer the question how that worked out, I need to put this whole thing into perspective. Back then, I also was a contributor to the SOAP framework, which is one of Python's oldest web frameworks, with more than 300 repositories. And back then, we were migrating it from Python 2 to Python 3. And actually, I was completely lost. I created lots of virtual environments, moved code back and forth, and at one point I asked the other maintainers, how do you do this with Python 2 and Python 3? It's so confusing. And they just, hey, we just use Tox. And that is the way I learned about Tox. And you have to imagine, back then, I was already 10 years in the industry as a professional Python developer, and I did not know about this tool. So I think it's super important, and it's great that you're here and you're learning and connecting with other people and learning about new tools to broaden your knowledge. So the resolution to the question whether Bernard finished the rewrite, yes. And it was a big success. And it was even way more scary than rewriting Tox because virtualenv has like 80 million downloads a month. So it's pretty crazy. And he also created a good talk about it. You should check it out about, how he thought about design and architecture and everything. And only a week after that, Bernard announced Tox second edition rewrite on Twitter. And only a little bit later, he created the first commit. And then something very special happened. Bernard started streaming the rewrite on Twitch. I learned about that on Twitter, and I certainly joined the Twitch streams. There were not a lot of visitors, maybe 3, 4, 5 or whatever, but I really, really enjoyed those streams. You need to imagine, back then I was the single Python developer in a small company with not a lot of contact to the outside world. And then there was this super experienced developer streaming the recreation of a tool I really felt in love with. And he was sharing his thoughts about the architecture and the design decisions. And it was so amazing for me. And I was completely sucked into this Tox thing. After that, I started answering Tox questions on Stack Overflow. So you may wondering, how can I answer questions for a thing I just started using? But I think this is a great way to learn more about a tool and the ins and outs of a tool by helping other people. I also gave a talk at Python Ireland meetup. At that time, I was super confused how to run my linters. Should I run them on my terminal? Should I run them in my IDE? Should I run them with Tox? Should I use pre-commit? And what about CI? This was so confusing to me. It took a while how I then I figured out a way how to combine these tools. And I think I came up with a pretty cool solution. And you can check it out on my lightning talk here. I also started contributing to discussions and to GitHub issues for talks. I answered new questions and followed up on issues. I went through the whole backlog of talks to check out whether some old issues could be closed. And then Bernard announced Talks 4 Alpha 2 on Twitter. He also asked the users to test because this was the first version you could really use in production. So I tested my personal projects, so my 10 or so work projects. And then I remembered, I also helped maintaining the 300 SOAP repositories, and they all use TOX. So I thought about, how could I test TOX 4 Alpha against the 300 repositories? And believe me, I did not want to do this manually. So I used another tool. It's called All Repos. It's a tool to clone and to manipulate repositories at scale. You can just enter a GitHub organization and it clones all the repositories and you can act on them. But it offered no way to run an arbitrary command line tool on these repositories. So I wrote a plugin and I ran Talks 4 Alpha on all 300 repositories to check out whether it's still compatible. And I did not say it was successful at first. There were only 22% of the repositories still working. So I reached out to Bernard, and he had the perfect answer. So a 22% success rate, that's not that great news. But on the plus side, if you fix SOAP, we should be in a decent place. And I think that's this is the way. You need to be optimistic about that. And at that time, we also got some feedback on Twitter, especially as Bernard announced that the plugin system for Talks 3 won't be compatible with the new one from Talks 4. And Oliver Westwater, back then also a Talks maintainer, asked, are the people with the torches and the pitchforks at the gates already? And spoiler, they were not yet. But we will come back to that later. And we also got some positive feedback from Jock, who is usually at every conference around the globe. I don't know why she's not here. So she reported a possible bug, which I could resolve, and then she said something nice. And you need to know feedback is something very important for us, the maintainers, because usually we only get bug reports and angry people when their CI broke. Or the people want their 500 lines configuration file for their multi-billion-dollar company debugged at night, at my spare time. So if you use open source software, please reach out to the maintainers and they thank you. And then I created my first serious pull request. I tried to fix the bugs I reported earlier, so I could give something back to Talks, because I was using it in every project. And I was actually pretty busy doing a lot of pull requests, one after another. And so it went on for some time. And then I was announced as a Talks maintainer by Bernard. And that was an amazing experience, becoming the maintainer of such an important and vital tool. Only a little bit later, I realized this is a lot of work for free. I created another talk about mass testing Talks 4 against the 300 SOAP repository at World Clone Day. And maybe you see a pattern. We tried to spread the word about the Talks 4 rewrite, to inform the people about it. As we were aware that when you do a rewrite, some bad things can happen. And we wanted all the users out there to test Talks 4 before the release. Bernard announced also Talks 4 at PyCon Yes, your lightning talk. And then imagine it's the end of 2021. We are 1.5 years in the rewrite, and people were already very impatient because Talks 3 and 4 are not compatible, and when they wanted to create a plugin, should they do it for the old or for the new one? And then life happened. Bernard moved to the US, and you don't do this on a weekend, right? I started building a house. And back then I also joined Canonical, and I certainly wanted to put in some effort to do a good job. And again, we are 1.5 years into the rewrite, And then we basically paused the rewrite for a full year because we were only 2 active maintainers and we both had no spare time. You can imagine that people got really angry. And here we go, back with the torches and the pitchforks. They were here. We got some feedback like this: just release it. That multi-year rewrite seems to never reach general availability. If it was a business, it would have been bankrupt a long time ago. And at first I thought, oh my God, what the... But then I thought, what if they're right? What if we're really doing something wrong? And once again, Bernard stepped in and gave a great answer. Such a major release will ultimately break a lot of people, and we need maintainer availability to help those users and address their concerns. So I think it's a great answer, and the content is basically, it's about our users and not about us, the maintainers. And then something remarkable happened, which I never experienced in my career before. We received a bug report about the vulnerability of PyLib, which is a dependency of TOX. And you need to know it's only used by TOX3, but not by TOX4. And it was only affected the SVN module of PyLib, which we do not even use. So we are not affected, right? But there are tools out there, like pip audit and safety, which check your complete supply chain, which is a good thing. But certainly now CI was broken for a lot of people out there, and there was no easy way out. We still had no time to move to TOX4 over the finish line. So as a compromise, we recommended to whitelist this vulnerability. It's not super nice, but it worked out. But that's not the end. Our friends at the PyTest team also received the same bug report about PyLib as a dependency of PyTest is vulnerable. And they did something different. For their next version, PyTest 7, they rendered PyLib, or parts of PyLib. So instead of installing PyLib from PyPI, they took the parts of PyLib they needed and put it in PyTest's codebase and stripped away all the things they did not need, like the SVN module. And this worked out really, really well for PyTest. But they rendered PyLib in a very special way. And now, the rendered PyLib shadows the installed PyLib in the side packages. So whenever TOX was trying to import from PyLib, it did not see the installed PyLib, but it tried to import from the rendered PyLib of PyTest. And that would have been a problem, but they did not render all the parts TOX needed. So TOX was broken, hard broken, whenever it was installed along PyTest 7. And this was a serious mess for us, because the combination of TOX and PyTest is super, super popular. But we still did not have the capacity to work on TOX4. And then something beautiful happened. Sorin Spranera, a longtime friend of TOX and a plugin author, announced to be able to work a full week on TOX4. He wanted to help us move it over the finish line. And at the end, maybe it was not even a full week, but it gave some great momentum. And also Bernard and I spent as much time on TOX4 as possible. And then, almost 3 years later after the start, TOX4 was finally released. That was a great relief, both for us, the maintainers, and our users. Can you imagine what happened after the release? We got a lot of bug reports. We got a lot of complaints. But we also got contributions from about 50 contributors. And we got some praise, which is always nice. So why do you think we got so many regressions? We took great care. We announced the rewrite on all channels. We tested TOX against hundreds and hundreds of projects, and still. So it's about Harem's law. And that says, with a sufficient number of users of an API, it does not matter what you promise in the contract. All observable behaviors of your system will be depended on by somebody. So we received bug reports for things we did not even know they were possible for TOX. But now we know. At that time, I was a little bit frustrated. we put a lot of effort into talks and people still got angry. Imagine, whenever I contribute to talks, I take away time from my family and my kids, and yet people still got angry. And at that time, I read a blog post. It's called "I'm Not Your Supplier." And that really resonated with me. I certainly do not want to break users. We do not create bugs on purpose. I do a lot of things in my spare time. And actually, I don't have a contract with the users. It's about anybody to use talks or not. And I don't want to bore you about the highlights of the release. You can check out our documentation. But when you have a close look at this list and recall what Bernard identified as the issues back then, we exactly achieved what we wanted. Now we can implement whatever is necessary for the future of talks. So we'll be able to easily maintain talks and extend it. And how was this possible? We used better abstractions. Before we had 1 to 3 huge files with mixed responsibilities. And now we have a config module for the configuration management, an execute module for the command execution. You get the idea. And this design evolved. It was not clear from the beginning. And now it's much easier to contribute to talks. Maybe it's also something for you. And we also sat down and discussed what we did well. We had a very strong automated test suite, so we did not find all the bugs. We announced the rewrite on every possible channel, multiple times, on Twitter, Mastodon, gave lightning talks. We announced it on the Python forum, but don't think people really test all of us. Some do, so thanks for that. We sticked around after release to help people with the migration and assess possible regressions. We kept the old documentation, as some people pin all the versions and use them for a while. We kept the Tox3 release branch and even released another release to ease the migration, although Tox3 is now unmaintained. And then we also sat down and discussed what we could have done better. And this sounds odd or even arrogant, right? So let's rephrase it. What could have we done better given the resources? And there was nothing. I think we had very, very limited time, and I think it went pretty well. There are also a couple of lessons learned from the rewrite of a project with millions and millions of users. You need to have a plan. You need to be ready to reevaluate everything from the ground up. You need to test a lot. You need to be available post-release. Prepare for bug fixes in the upcoming months after release. And be nice, but set boundaries. And cheers to you, Joel. I'm sorry, not sorry, but legends are not always right. Rewrites can be highly successful. Thank you very much for attending my talk. Thanks to the organizers, and thanks for Canonical to have me here.
Thank you, Jürgen. As a reminder, if you want to ask a question, raise your hand or go to slido.com. There's a comment here saying, kudos for using pipex in the example.
Yeah, I love it.
Do I see a hand up?
What were the major arguments to not evolve Tox3 into Tox4 gradually instead of the rewrite?
Could you please repeat the question?
What were the main arguments to not rewrite Tox3 gradually and evolve it into Tox4?
Yeah, Tox3, we identified a couple of major pain points in Tox3, which, as I mentioned early in the beginning, were just not, it was not feasible to do a gradual rewrite. Also, the test suite was very closely coupled to the implementation, so we wanted to give it a completely fresh restart. Well, I joined only after the initial thing was done, but there was a lot of, well, also when you do open source work, basically mostly for free, but you're also encouraged to ask your employer to give you some time, because otherwise you can't work around the clock. It's always great to have something you want to really work on, which is fun for you. So Tox3 was back then, I think, still compatible with Python 2.7, and it's when you want to do a new thing, you want to use newer Python versions, so I think the minimum Python version we used was Python 3.7. We wanted to use typing. We wanted to use all the bells and whistles and have some fun while doing it. And I think that's a very important part of contributing to open source. It's not only about the users, but also about the maintainers having fun and make it more sustainable.
Hello, thank you for this talk. I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say thank you for the maintenance of these technologies that a wide range of community uses. So thank you for this work, and yeah, keep it going.
Thank you.